So let me just hit record. So welcome everybody to the fourth and final Harvardwood speaker series for the fall 2020 modules. This is our showrunner panel. We're really excited to have our guests with us today. So first of all, we have Jacque Edmonds Cofer, who was a showrunner on Moesha, Let's Stay Together, Read Between the Lines, and Tangled, who's currently a co-executive producer on The Unicorn. So welcome, Jacque. We have Damond Lindelof, who was showrunner on Lost, The Leftovers, and the Watchmen miniseries on HBO from last year. And finally, we have Sarah Treem, who was a showrunner on The Affair on Showtime and was also on In Treatment and House of Cards prior to that. So welcome, you guys. Thanks so much for being here today. So I want to start with a really basic question. Can you guys name all of the departments that report to you when you have a show that's up and running? And I'm going to try and keep track of how many there are.
Am I allowed to cheat with a call sheet?
You absolutely are, yes.
Hair and makeup, transportation, wardrobe, lighting and grips, lighting and electric, craft services. What else?
Casting,
editing, writing, directing,
post, production, vis effects.
PR, yeah.
Music.
Locations. Production.
I'll just clarify though at the showrunners differently, and I'll just say, you know, a number of those department heads that that Sarah and Jacque just rattled off do not report directly to me. That is like very much so on certainly on The Leftovers and Watchmen and to some degree Lost. There was an executive producing director who was basically on those locations. So Hawaii or Australia, Austin, and Atlanta respectively, where those department heads who were more production oriented, hair and makeup, you know, lighting, gaffing, et cetera, they directly reported to Nicole Cassell or Mimi Leader. And unless there was like some reason that I needed to be engaged in those conversations, they had complete and total autonomy to deal with that. So I think just specifically to the way that I do the job, I think that the culture has decided that the showrunner is the writer, you know, the vision behind the show. And that's been immensely beneficial for me. But the way that the show is actually run and managed, it actually happens between about 4 or 5 different individuals, of which I am one. And my focus is primarily on the creative and the editorial. And I obviously, you know, have final word on casting decisions and music decisions and all that. But in terms of how the production of the show, I relegate and delegate autonomy to my partners.
Sarah and Jacque, would you say that's the case on the shows you work on as well?
It's largely the case, you know, outside of casting, writing, directing, a lot of those responsibilities, the more functional responsibilities, are handled by a unit production manager, a line producer, or someone like that. But as showrunner, anything bad kind of trickles up or anything controversial. So even while I might not be, you know, on day-to-day basis, might not be involved, the overall responsibility is sort of mine.
Yeah, my show was a little, I had a producing director the first couple of seasons and then I didn't for the last couple of seasons. And so, so for the last couple of seasons, it was all reporting directly to me. But, you know, I was also in the same place that it was shooting. And it wasn't like a particularly, you know, exotic show in terms of like locations and stuff like that. So yeah, I think what Damon says is like, it's true that everything runs differently. It depends on the budget of your show sometimes, you know, depends on where it's shooting. It depends on your preference. Depends on the culture of the network, stuff like that.
Yeah. I'd imagine that trying to run a show based in Hawaii or based in, Little Rock, Arkansas is going to be vastly different from running a show that shoots on a soundstage here in Los Angeles. So your responsibilities and
Very different.
your accessibility is also going to be very different as well.
Mhm.
So how many meetings would you say you have on a given day when your room is running and your show is also in production? And, I take with a grain of salt, like every day is different in your life. But, if you could give me a ballpark.
A lot.
I
Yeah.
mean, it frequently seems like one continuous meeting that is interrupted by other meetings. So
Yeah. I mean, it's especially if you're in pre-production for an episode, which you usually are, if you're in production at all.
right.
So yeah, it is. I mean, I think that the thing that's challenging sometimes is to figure out when and how to write around production.
Start of Curate, 30 a day, if we woke up, looked at it scheduled, in addition to like room time or like an editing session or something like that. But by the time we, put our phones down and go to bed, there are a little bit of like 25 meetings that happen. That is to say, I'm counting a 20-minute phone call from somebody as the meeting, because they're requiring some level of direction from us as to what to do. Sometimes those meetings are happening with the studio because you're in a budget battle. That's the thing that is, I think, probably overlapping in all of our Venn diagrams, which is the budget battles never stop. Like it doesn't, they're ongoing constantly until the moment that you lock, the sound mix of the final episode. You're constantly sort of scraping and fighting to reallocate funds and trying to get more, and listening to people yell at you for spending too much. And like those are necessary meetings that we would all rather not take, but must be taken, and they very often are the ones that are not scheduled, but are absolutely required.
So lots of responsibility, a lot of overwhelming amount of detail. I can imagine that it becomes very difficult to keep track of all of that in your head. And Sarah and Damon, I know I've been talking to your assistants to make sure that you can coordinate this particular meeting. How reliant would you say you are on your assistant, and what type of person do you like to put in that role?
I think you're very reliant on your assistant, for sure. And I think it also depends on where you are in your life. Like when I was like pregnant or nursing during production, that was a whole other thing that my assistant had to help me coordinate. So I think that it depends on where you are in your life, but sometimes the people that are your assistants get incredibly intimate with you, because they're involved in every aspect. So I tend to look for women, not always, but usually, because it's often like a good, it can be a good stepping stone to, another when they take these jobs. Although it's a strange job, I think, sometimes for people who want to be writers. A tremendous amount of exposure to like all elements, every day you're on all calls, or you actually are tremendously exposed to what's happening at like the network level, which is pretty high. It's usually even a level that most of the writers on staff don't know what's going on, but your assistant, as an assistant, you do, because you're coordinating those calls and oftentimes on them. So it's like such a tremendous opportunity, a job that leaves a lot of time to do your own work. And I often think that, like, really the path towards success in this industry is to be a good writer. And the only way to be, it's a tricky job. Like my recommendation would be, if you're interested in doing it, do it for sure, but maybe don't stay there. You'll get stuck there because it just doesn't give you that much time to pursue your own craft, which is what you should be doing at this point.
Yeah, I would echo what Sarah said, and essentially, I have a new assistant who basically came onto my desk, and I'm putting the air quotes around that because my desk is virtual now. Is that we've had very limited, I basically interviewed him and hired him over Zoom, and he's wonderful, but he's at the beginning of his time with me. And I sort of agree with the idea of like, after about a year and a half, you've learned all there is to learn on my desk, because it's particularly if I'm show intensive, like the idea of like being a mentor or taking the time to essentially apprentice, like allow someone to be my apprentice, is not really in the cards so much. I'm there and available to answer questions, but that's very different than teaching. And so like use my desk and the position that it offers as a way to make connections and figure out where it is you want to go next. Sometimes that individual is a writer, and sometimes they're more interested. Was an assistant before I became a professional writer. I worked for an agent, I worked for a studio executive, I worked for a producer, and then I worked for another producer, and then I worked for a production executive. And that experience gave me a lot of knowledge that I later applied once I became a showrunner, because, and I'm sure that Jackie and Sarah have sort of similar stories, but like nothing prepares you to be a showrunner, because we're writers. We're trained to be, sensitive and empathic, and the idea of firing people or crunching numbers or managing a staff of 150 people, or figuring out what's going to be the Christmas gift this year. That's not our skill set. Our skill set is the crafting of story, and all the creative stuff is a lot more fun, but you have to get very good at the other stuff, and become a manager. And so if I didn't have those skills as an assistant, basically I treated my post-college life as grad school, because I couldn't afford grad school. So I just basically spent like a year on those 5 desks, and came out the other side of it, kind of ready to begin my professional writing career. But I agree that you can get stuck, and if you're just working for a person with hopes of they're going to promote you and put you in a writer's room on their next show, etc., you are putting all of your eggs into one basket. If that happens, great. And some showrunners will hire assistants and say, that's the design, that's the plan for you. You're going to start here on the shows, and then they didn't work for me directly anymore. That was much more of once you're a writer's assistant, the pathway up to writer is much clearer than I think it is being on someone's desk.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. As you were talking, I was thinking about my former assistants, and I don't think any of them have become writers. Several have gone into production, which is interesting, because those are the relationships that they were building while they were working with me. But also the ones who did go from working with me to being writer's assistants have continued to get scripts on different shows and are working their way up. So I don't think, totally agree with what Damon's saying. It's an entryway into the industry, certainly, and to getting to know all those network people and production people and working your way in that way. But as a direct line into a writer's room, it's not necessarily the direct path that you might think it is.
One thing that I have found is kind of fun though to watch is that like the assistants oftentimes become very close to each other on the show, so the writer's assistant and the showrunner's assistant and the writer's PA and the script coordinator and other people that sort of on the staff level, like at least on my shows, they all became super close, and they went into writing groups together, and so it was an opportunity for them to develop a community at their own level. And I think it's been very valuable for them. It's like that you need, especially in Los Angeles, or in television, in this industry, you need a family, you need a group, you need people to read your writing, you need peers. And it's a good way, I think, to meet those people. And then what's been nice for me is watching. I mean, I have promoted a bunch of assistants to writers on staff over the years, and and I do. I mean, everybody sort of works differently, but I do think it's a bit of indentured servitude. So, you do want the people who kind of give you their lives to go on and to succeed and to get to do what they want to do. But what's been really nice for me is to watch them sort of succeed with each other, and to go onto other staffs, to bring each other over, to like recommend each other. I mean, there's a whole group of them now, and they're very close, and sometimes I feel like left out because they don't invite me to their writers groups. But that's been nice. It's been nice to see that community kind of develop and be like, oh yeah, these are the kids they're going to be running this town in like 20 years, 10 years probably.
Trying to imagine being the writer's assistant who invites you to come and join their writing group, and that's an email I just can't ever imagine sending.
Workshop too, like, why not? But no, they're never an
Damon, something you said about the way that somebody trains to be a showrunner actually brought up a point I wanted to mention to Jacque, which was your somewhat unusual path to end up as a showrunner. So you have an MBA from Harvard Business School, and I just wanted to ask, do you find that education background has helped you in the role as showrunner?
Yes, and for exactly the reasons that Damon was mentioning, things like budgeting and human resource management and dealing with the network in the studio and that sort of thing was, I think, a lot more natural to me, having had a career, training at business school and then a career in the corporate world before I moved over to writing. It's sort of second nature to me, where I've seen some other friends, sort of push it to the side or have to, play catch up along the way, learn along the way. So I think that was, it has been a help in helping me move forward quickly. And then, there's the networking aspect of it. And the showrunner on the first show I was on was 2 years ahead of me at Harvard Business School. So even though I didn't know him, I think there was a comfort level there with him hiring me for my first staff job.
Wow, that's incredible that you had that high level of concentration of people with that education background in one room. I've never heard of that before. That's so cool.
Yeah.
So I'm going to pivot slightly. How many scripts or pitches do you think you have sold that are just never going to see the light of day?
How many have been sold that won't ever get made?
Yeah, like things that you've worked on that you were excited about and kind of reached the point where somebody was interested in helping you work on it and develop it, but it just never really made it out of the development phase.
I had a lot back at HBO, like 4 maybe. Yeah, at least 4, I think.
I've been enormously fortuitous in that scenario, because essentially I was on an NBC show for 3 years, and one of the things that NBC did at the time was, if they wanted to keep you on that show, so I was like a supervising mid-level writer on a successful procedural. If they want to keep you on that show, they'd give you a development deal, and you would write a pilot for them that they had zero intention whatsoever of doing anything with. But it was a way to kind of give you an extra fee and also make you feel like your voice was valuable and that they saw you as a potential future showrunner. So I wrote a pilot for them, and that happened a couple months before I was introduced to J.J. Abrams, and then Lost happened, and that was not a thing that we pitched. It was just like, it was a runaway train that I feel like I alternately running alongside and trying to jump on, or getting run over by, one of those. And then once that happened, once Lost was over, that was the next 6 years of my life. And then once Lost was over, I fell in love with a book, and that ended up being The Leftovers. And I talked Tom Perrotta into allowing me to partner with him. And then HBO already had bought the book before I was involved. So that was the next 3 years of my life. And then as The Leftovers was ending, HBO was like, we really want to do something with Watchmen. And if you're not doing it, then we're going to offer it to somebody else. And so I was like, okay, that's, I've loved Watchmen since I was 13 years old, and I'm terrified of it, but I think it's really interesting. And so I think a lot of writer producers, they develop a lot of shit, a lot of stuff, and with hopes of figuring out which one is going to be the one that they're passionate about or is going to stick. And I look at people like Greg Berlanti or Ryan Murphy or Shonda Rhimes, and I go, I don't understand how they are capable of generating such high quality work at this output. I mean, but I did 28 episodes of Leftovers, 9 episodes of Watchmen. So that's my math's at 37 episodes of television. That was 5 years. And in the previous 6 years, I did 121 hours of Lost. So like, I kind of feel like my output varies, but I do one thing at a time. I fall in love with something, and I'm just basically like, we're making this. I haven't really put myself in a position where I can get passed on, probably to insulate my own, sense of self-worth. But it's just like, so it's something to look forward to. I'm sure within the next decade, there will be piles of things that I wanted to do that never see the light of day. This is the law of the universe, as it should be.
I'm rooting for you to keep batting 100, just so you know.
I think the phrase is batting 1,000, Daniel. Batting
1,000. Oh God!
One out of every 9 at bat.
Did I just out myself as not a sports fan?
It's the one thing I know about sports. The one thing I know about.
Awesome. So let me ask this: how do you think you've evolved in your role as a showrunner from your first time at bat, throwing more sports references at you?
Well, for me, I think it kind of goes back to your question about assistants. I think for the first show or two, I was sort of hands on everything. I wasn't that much of a delegator. I wanted to, and then, I started losing hair and losing sleep because it is a 24-hour day job. So I think I'm more relaxed about things and, getting people that I trust and letting them do their jobs.
Yeah, I think getting more relaxed is probably the name of the game. Yeah, I think in the beginning it's interesting. I mean, I'm watching friends go through it now for the first time, and the patterns are really similar. I think the learning curve is really similar, and like I had a joke actually because I did the first year of House of Cards before I did The Affair, and when on the first year of The Affair, I actually sent an email to the showrunner of House of Cards. It was basically an apology email. Like, I'm sorry for being such a brat on your show, because now I understand everything that you were dealing with, and I just made your life harder, and I'm really sorry. And I told that story on the first season of The Affair, I think, to my writers. And then a year or 2 later, 2 years later, something like that, one of the writers from The Affair had gone on and was running her own show. And she sent me an email, and she was like, do you remember that email that you sent to Bill Williman? This is that email. And she was like, I'm sorry for being such a brat on your show. So I think it's, you're as Damon said, you're a writer to start with. You're not with some exceptions, you're not usually trained in management. And so the learning curve is super steep. That you have a huge ego. So you kind of go into somebody else's show and you're just like, I could do this better. This person doesn't know what they're doing. And then what you realize when you're running your own show is actually you have no idea what they were dealing with, because the writer's room is a pretty separate space. So I think it's quite a humbling experience, actually. But what's nice is, after you've done it for a while and then other people start to do it under you, and you get to see. I actually think the mark of an incredibly successful writer's room, I always said this about Alan Ball, about 6 Feet Under, was that room went off to run a lot of, that group of writers stayed together for, I think, the last couple of years of 6 Feet Under. And then most of them went off to run their own shows. I mean, they're very famous writers who came out of that 6 Feet Under writer's room. And I always thought, God, he must have been doing something right in that writer's room, because he was teaching people how to run television shows. And so I was very proud when people who come up in my room go on to run their own shows, because I feel like, okay, we were doing something right.
I think that's really, by the way, a great metric for success, because you should be attracted to people who want to do it themselves, even though that challenges you. You know, when you have that kind of an ego in the room, you know, I was definitely on both sides of that coin, where I didn't feel like I could do it better, but I definitely felt like, oh, I can do this. And then, you know, found myself in situations where the writer's room would be an open revolt, and I would say, I wish upon you to have your own show. And they're like, are you cursing us right now? And I was like, yes. They're like, because this sounds like a kind of beautiful thing to be wishing for us. And I'm like, you will see. Like, anyway, I think that, you know, and it was a procedural cop drama with Don Johnson early, you know, mid to late 90s. But out of that room came like Sean Ryan and Glenn Mazzara and John Worth, Carlton Cuse, Harvard alum, obviously like trained me and mentored me, and then partnered with me on Lost. So I think that idea of saying like, you know, it would be great if people come off of my show and then run their own shows. That's the most exciting thing, because, you know, you can trace the roots all the way. It was bigger than us all.
I love that. So then this question comes in from someone anonymously. As somebody who's a working writer, building their credits, trying to become a showrunner ultimately, how can you gain those skills that are needed to be a successful showrunner without going back into assisting?
Well, I think there's a lot of different paths. But I do think at the end of the day, like what people are looking for is good writing, like good writing and good writers. So I've definitely had experience talking to younger people who like say that they want to be showrunners, you know, and I'll say, okay, great, like, let me see something that you've written. They have a pitch for something or whatever, but they don't have a script, or they don't have a good script. And so that's where you want to start. You know, that like I do know that there's sort of people who are journeymen who kind of get to the showrunning position through other places, but the surest, directest route to having your own television show is having your own voice, you know, and having a great idea, having something that people want to see, and something that's really original. So I think that's always my recommendation to people. Like, just do whatever you need to do to get better as a writer. You know, you want to be an assistant, be an assistant. You want to be a waitress, be a waitress. Like, it doesn't really matter as long as you're getting better on the page. And then if you're really good on the page and you're very confident and you have a voice and you can defend it and you can kind of build a world. Like, I'm always looking for writers who, because I came out of theater, so I'm always looking for writers who are, you know, it's not just about writing a good scene. It's not even just about writing a good script. It's about having a whole world, you know, being able to tell me a story from beginning to middle to end. And I used to think, actually, because in theater, that's how playwrights do it. You know, it's just a playwright on the page. You don't have a team of people around you. So I used to think that was just something that everybody could do. And then I realized as I got further into television that actually not everybody can do it. But if you can, you know, if you can go in and tell a full story all the way through, like, you are actually really ahead of the game. And that's, I think, what executives are looking for, you know, that being able to tell the full story combined with being very good on the page, being confident, having a voice, like that. If you all have all that, you know, people will help you become a showrunner. You know, they'll put other people around you to help your vision become realized. You know, they'll give you mentors, they'll give you supervisors. You know, it may not always be people that you want, but they'll do it, because that's such a valuable commodity. So I mean, I'm interested to hear from everybody else, but my feeling would be that whatever you need to do to keep writing is what you should do.
I was just going to agree. because as Damon was saying about, his first experience on Nash Bridges, people who are running shows are very tired people. And so when they recognize a good writer, it's like, oh my God, thank God, I can breathe freely for a couple of minutes or hours or whatever, because I know the script is going to come in good because Damon wrote it, and so I'm going to be more open to his ideas or, helping him get to the next level. Whether he's a writer on staff or even someone that I've just read, I'll be encouraged to help them take whatever next step it is, because I know that they've worked hard and they're good at what they're doing, and it's a matter of time before they get there, but I'd like to help speed that along if I can. So no, I think just being good at it and continuously working at it until you're better is really the key.
I couldn't agree with what Jackie and Sarah said more. And I would just say that in answer to your question, I think that there's a very fine line between ambition and aggression. That idea of sort of like, in order to become a showrunner, you have to be ambitious, but you can't be aggressive in terms of over asking for what your station is. There are hierarchical structures that exist on television shows, and part of the job is becoming aware of the politics. Who's the showrunner? Who do they listen to? Who do they trust? How long has this person been here? Like the idea of jumping steps or skipping over, like, this idea of, paying your dues or investing time. These are all things that ideally happen intuitively, but they're not taught. You just have to kind of sit back. But if you sit back for too long, someone's going to say like, oh, Damon doesn't want this bad enough, or he's perfectly content to just kind of write his own episodes and produce his own episodes, but he's not like going to be anything more than just sort of like a journeyman writer, and that's fine. So you want to identify yourself as being hungry, but you can't be starving. And I think that I was a writer on Crossing Jordan, which was my show after Nash Bridges, where I had a little bit of experience now, but I came in as an executive story editor, and there were writers who were above me, co-executive producers, supervising producers, co-producers. And instead of end-arounding them and going right to the showrunner and saying, I want more responsibility, I started hanging out in their offices, and saying to them, what can I do? Can I sit and watch you cut? Do you mind if I sit in the production meeting? Because they're not inviting the executive story editors, but can I sit and watch your production meeting? And then they would ask the showrunner. And then I started to develop a relationship with the showrunner. But like, there is like a hierarchical structures where you don't want to step on people's toes. And I'll just say this because as the white man of the three of us, those white men are afforded a lot more toe stepping than it's sort of like understood and expected and allowed in a way that it shouldn't be. And when women and people of color do it, it's put into the aggressive category as opposed to the ambitious category, just by definition. And I think that hopefully we're much more aware of that matrix and talking about it more, but it still exists where this is the way that the culture, allows these systems to work as, oh, he's just ambitious, as opposed to aggressive. And I think back on, it took me 3 years on Crossing Jordan before I was in an editing room, with the showrunner talking about a cut with him. But you have to have patience. That's the other thing that I worry most about with the generation coming up, is that, and because I've supervised millennials and even some Gen Z members of staff, and they're basically like, after 2 months, they're like, I really can do this. I want my own show. And the scary part is the networks and studios are giving it to them because the desire and hunger for content is so high right now that they're taking really great writers and they're putting them behind the wheel of this machinery before they've had any experience watching how it's operated. And I know that I sound a bit of an old fogey saying this, but I'm just like you can't go back. You get this one opportunity to learn. And once you're in that seat, you can't ever go back. No one's going to hire you to be a co-producer on their show once you've run your own show. or it's going to be much more challenging at the very least.
Speaking as one of those people who spent 2 months on a show and was like, I know I can do this better than my showrunner. I was in for a very rude awakening when I started learning these lessons that you're talking about, Damon, and started realizing actually my boss's job is really hard, and how dare I actually think these things. So I'm sure I'm going to be sending that brat email sooner rather than later. Let's talk a little bit about staffing. So let's say you have a new room that's going to be starting up. What are you looking for in the writers that you're going to build your room out with?
Well, I think, what Sarah said still rings true. The first is, the script and the writing. If it's not someone that you know and you've worked with before, so that, then it's the first thing is the script. Because I do comedy, the second thing is, are they funny? Is something in this script making me laugh in a, specific or unusual or a different way? And, can they tell, again, as Sarah said, a story from beginning to the end that makes sense, that doesn't take, it can be inventive, but not crazy flights of fancy that I can't put on CBS, within a very, very specific structure. So, are they funny? Do they follow the rules of storytelling well? And then once you meet them, then it's just a sort of personality fit. When you're building a room, you want different, particularly in a comedy room, you want people who are funny. You want people who are really deep in character, who understand the essences of character and how to make those funny and make them all play together inside 20 minutes and 30 seconds. And then, there is a degree of personality fit. How are they going to work with me? Do they seem like they will get along with others? And some of that comes from your meeting with them, and some of it comes from references and referrals. I will definitely call around and say, do you know this person? And, people that I trust to tell me if they are great people or, have asshole tendencies, because, we're together for many, many hours and you don't want to have to deal with that. So yeah, it's all of those things that you look for in any job, but fundamentally is, can they write in a way that's going to elevate my show?
Yeah, I find that all showrunners have a very different response to this question, because all writing staffs are really different, and everybody runs it really differently. So it's like you could ask the question and get like as many different answers as there are shows. But I mean, I think yes, you're definitely looking for people who can write to start with, people who get along with. I actually tend to run my rooms sort of like democracies. They're small. They tend to be small. They tend to be like 5 or 6 other people. And I want everybody to feel on the same level, like whether they're staff writers or co-EPs or whatever. I want us to be able to talk to each other like equals, because the truth is that that when a writer's room runs really well, it's like a place with a tremendous amount of trust, and freedom and ability to, you want people to bring, I mean, I'm in drama, so you want people to bring in like their secrets, their shame, their darkness, the things that they don't, the time that they really acted against their best interest and then lied about it later, the thing that they haven't admitted to themselves. Like that's the gold of drama. So you need people to feel safe in order to do that. And so if you're, to build that kind of a safe space with people you don't know, because I tend to be totally honest, bring a lot of people with me over the years, mostly just because once I've developed a relationship and a rapport with them, and I feel safe with them and they feel safe with me, they become very valuable. It's like, it's like you sort of developing these relationships and then they pay off in dividends. So I tend to work with the same people if I can, but I can't always. But if I'm building a new room, like I just need to like the person as in to be respectful of other people and as sort of a safe person to work with. And usually that, that just turns out to be a very mature person, like somebody who's, kind of lived a life, dealt with some shit, it can appreciate somebody else's perspective, can handle conflict, like things, knows how to communicate, like things like that. Yeah, I don't know. There was I once worked with a woman whose brother was Theo Epstein, who ran the clubs at the point, and she told me about the way that he would build the team, and it wasn't just about bringing the best players. It was about bringing the best people. That he felt, that when he was building a baseball team, he wanted it to be good people, and I think that that's actually the same is true in a writing room. Yeah.
I'm gonna have a hard time verbalizing it better than Sarah and Jackie just did. I agree with everything that they just said 1,000%. I would say, our initial exposure to most of these writers before we meet with them is their writing. We read their scripts, and there's usually something about their writing that like speaks to me. I respond. There was a time in our business where the preferred sample was a spec of an episode of television that was already on. So it was like, when I was trying to break through, I had my Sopranos spec and my West Wing spec. Now the trend in the business is towards reading something original. I've hired novelists, playwrights, but when I hire other television writers, I want their voice. So I'm like, what have you spec'd out a pilot? Do you have, to your point earlier, Daniel, did you have a show that didn't go? I want to get some sense of you-ness. And then it's a matter of whether or not I think that there's space for their voice, because I don't view the job as taking someone's voice and making it sound like my voice. It's creating the show's voice. And that's why I feel like the 3 shows that I've worked on all have a similarity in their Venn diagram. That's me, but they all feel very different. And the reason that they feel different is they were written by entirely different rooms. And it's so exciting. It's hard for me to start over every time, but that's really exciting because the trust that Sarah speaks about is something that you build. It's a gift. No one is going to give that to you as their default position. And I will say that, prior to Watchmen, I was curating for comfort, my own comfort. These are the people that I spend an hour or 90 minutes having a meeting with you after I've read your writing, and then I have to decide whether I'm not going to spend the next year and a half with you in a room every day for 10 to 12 hours. I'm curating for comfort. And as a result of that, I ended up tribalizing my rooms by hiring white 40-ish men who were into Star Wars, because I'm like, oh, I'll be comfortable around this guy. I'm never going to say anything that's going to offend this guy. This guy knows me. This guy has kids, my kid's age. And instead taking the time to really get to know someone and understand what their voice is going to lend to the show, and potentially leading to moments of discomfort. You can have uncomfortable writing rooms and still have trust. And in fact, the moments of discomfort sort of yielded the most incredible story moments in everything that I've ever worked on. But they were sweaty, and when you come out of it, you do have this feeling of like, we really went through the fire together, but we all had each other's backs. That's an incredible thing. And the only other thing that I'd say is, in hiring now, I acknowledge that I'm going to be like 2 for 3. That means every 3 people I hire, one of them isn't going to work, because you just don't know. And that creates a little bit more space for me. It's mercenary to say, I'm going to hire 9 people and I'm going to end up with 6 people, but it actually, it makes the hiring decisions a little bit less intensive if you're basically like, okay, well, I'm going to take a risk on this person because they do have, as Jackie said, asshole tendencies, but maybe they're just like kind of puffing out their chest in this meeting, because I have asshole tendencies, as many of you have probably figured out by now, but it doesn't mean that I can't be a productive storyteller.
I think as writers, we all do have asshole tendencies. There's a certain stubbornness and a certain emotionality and sensitivity to us. And a lot of what you guys have been saying here is learning how to communicate that, as Sarah said, with maturity, and knowing how to do it without, either pissing people off or at least like doing it in a productive manner, I think is really important. And I'm hearing that a lot in this conversation, so I just want to say that's really cool to hear. I just want to ask, how do writers end up on your reading list for snapping, and how important are representatives to that process?
Well, they're usually sort of the first ones in. I'm working on a pilot now that the outline hasn't even been turned in yet, and my manager is sending me people who sort of demographically fit the profile of the lead character. So yeah, they're kind of important, depending on how much you trust them and their taste. But they're like I said, they're the first ones in. There are a number of writing programs that you can look for new writers, which have been, that's the way I came in, and I think those are important as well. And then friends and family referrals are also, pretty key.
Yeah.
But part of the problem is that it's usually such a compressed process that your show gets picked up, and then you start writing. You don't have a whole lot of time to read, and in my opinion, enough time to read and meet and talk to all the people that you'd like to, in order to form this idyllic writer's room. So you're doing it under a lot of stress and pressure, while other things like the fact that you have a new show are coming at you. So it's certainly a far from perfect process, and you need to use the filters that you trust. That's why I said about your reps. They'll deluge you with writers. They'll send you deluge of writers if you let them. So you have to really just in all ways rely on people you trust.
Yeah, I think that's, it used to be that like the big agencies would send you stacks, of like, right, these are our top. That's how it was when I did The Affair. When I did this last writer's room, it was much more hodgepodge, but it was limited. So I don't know if it was, and I already had a bunch of people that I knew I was going to hire. But when they did, but yes, I think, having reps at top tier agencies who are excited about you is your best chance of being read. The other thing is, like, I agree that there's not a lot of time. And so when I would get these huge stacks, I would usually tend to only read about the first 10 pages of a script, to be totally honest, maybe 20, to see if there was a voice there. And if there wasn't, I would just move on and go on to the next one. So, if you are going to get read, the material that you send, like, make sure you've got a good 10 or 20 pages. And that's not necessarily like, there needs to be like, pyrotechnics, there doesn't, but there needs to be a voice on the page that grabs you. And then I don't know, I tend to like to read plays. I don't know if any of you are playwrights, but I love reading new plays. So when I was coming up, the idea that somebody would read a play was a little bit, unusual. But now I think there are so many people who are coming from theater in television that, like, if somebody sends me a new play, especially something that's been produced, like, I'm thrilled to read it. So yeah, and I think, Damon was saying novelists and journalists as well. Like, it doesn't even necessarily have to be screenwriting anymore. It just needs to be like somebody who's writing with passion and clarity to break in.
Yeah, I'm still on a bit of an anti-agency kick, not just because of the Writers Guild action with agencies, but I think, like, my general sense of, when an agent sends you a pile of scripts, like, why am I allowing them to curate the pool from which I'm selecting my staff, when I have the least in common with agents, as curators of talent? They've signed their writing talents, and so they believe in them, but they don't know whether or not that individual is right for the show. And so I self-curate. So, I saw an episode of Master of None that blew my doors off, and I just was like, who wrote this episode? And looked at the credits, and it was a guy named Cord Jefferson. And I started asking, does anyone know who Cord Jefferson is? And my friend Mike Schur, who created Parks and Rec, and at the time was doing The Good Place, was like, yeah, I actually hired him on The Good Place. And so he hooked me up with Cord, and I just took Cord out to dinner, and we started a friendship. And so when Watchmen became a thing, I reached out to him and was like, oh, would you be available to come and work on this show? And then the other thing is that I had the benefit of HBO, and I understand that that's a very special place to be working, but their executives, they know me after having worked hand in hand with me on The Leftovers for 3 years. They know what my sensibilities are and my tastes are. So they kind of curated a stack of like 20 writers that they thought would be good for Watchmen. And then that was the pool from which I ended up hiring almost the entire staff. There were 3 writers who I brought over from Leftovers, but everybody else was recommended by HBO, who as Sarah said, some of them were playwrights. They came from they weren't all just defined as television writers. And I was actually trying to curate for minimal TV experience, because I have a lot of institutionalized television experience. A couple of the other writers who were already coming over from Leftovers did. So I was like, I want newbies who haven't been institutionalized in how a television show is written, because they're much more likely to pitch things to teach me, because I actually, the older I get, the more regimented I get in my thinking of this is how you tell a story. But if you bring someone in who doesn't know how to do it yet, you go like, ooh, like that, you can do it that way? That's cool. Like, I think the minute that I stop learning, my stuff's going to start getting incredibly stale. And it's also exciting to learn. It's humbling, and at times frustrating, but like the reality is I have so much to still figure out about how we do this. And it is magic to some degree. Like sometimes the simplest stuff is the hardest to execute. You've got to get it just right. The more that I open myself to the possibility that I don't know everything, the better the work seems to be.
I love that, even in a position that you find yourself in, Damon, where you've found so much success, that the idea of being open to learning new things still is very much at the forefront of your mind. And I feel like most successful showrunners that I know find themselves in that position, which I think is really, really cool. And I can see that in all 3 of you. So just my compliments to you. I kind of want to shift a little bit and talk about running a room at the moment. So when you're first starting up a room, do you like to kind of blue sky your story points in your character journeys, or are there other things you're focusing on when you're like getting things up and running for a new show or a new season? In
terms of the story?
Yeah, in terms of the story for, if you have 10 episodes, what is the 10 episode arc for the season going to look like?
Yeah, I tend to think of television, dramatic writing in general, but specifically television writing, as like solving a geometric proof, where you basically the beginning and the end, and you have a hypothesis that you think is basically going to get you from the beginning to the end. And then, it's about the sort of like how elegantly, what are the steps that you can take with the tools that you have at your disposal, being the characters, the place, the conflict, like how elegantly can you kind of get through that proof to wind up, at your end. And sometimes, you adjust your end because it turns out your hypothesis is wrong or your end is wrong or something like that. But usually I have like a beginning and end and like some tentpole, like, some things that I know are going to happen in the show that season. Like I've already sort of thought like, these are big events that I know we're going to hit. And then I'll put this up on the board usually before the writing staff comes in, or I'll work with another writer, just the two of us for a couple weeks, and get a sort of an outline, a season outline sort of up in some fashion. You know, it's usually pretty rough, but I find it's helpful to have that to start with, as opposed to just like, you know, coming in with like a complete blank. I've been in rooms like that before, and it can be, you know, you're trying to like guess what's in the showrunner's mind, and it can be pretty brutal. So it's helpful, I think, as a showrunner to at least give people like a sense of what is the story you're trying to tell this year. What is the question you're trying to answer, like the problem you're trying to solve. So I try to do that if possible. But I don't know, what do you guys do?
Yeah, I think that's basically, you know, you know where you're starting and you have a sense of where you want to end up. But like Damon was saying, I'm always so excited when someone has a totally different path to get there, or totally different signposts along the way to get the characters there than what I, you know, in my feeble mind think would be a straight, direct, easy path. You know, someone else has a mountainous road that's going to be tremendous to investigate, you know. So, and like you were saying, Sarah, you know, you might not even end up at that endpoint because there might be a better one or more interesting one, or what you thought was the endpoint might be 3/4 of the way through. But yeah, I think you do have to start with at least some sort of a roadmap, and then have your writers, you know, prove you wrong or come up with something better.
Yeah, I mean, having seen Sarah and Jackie's work and the work of our peers, that I think like is sort of like universally stuff that we admire. The approach is always that we spend a lot more time talking about character and what's driving the characters and what makes people tick, and what they want and what's stopping them from getting what they want. And then that starts to manifest itself as actually story. So I always, when I kind of get lost in the weeds, I always default back to, wait a minute, like who, like, I like to do episodic structure where you're switching whose episode it is, whose point of view you're in. And so it's like, what does Lori want again in this episode? Like, what is she chasing? Does she even know? At what point in the episode is she going to figure it out? And that's become my process. And the other thing is that, having moved to a format of shortened seasons in a cable space versus where I cut my teeth, which was in a network space, the first thing that I do in my room is spend at least 8 to 10 weeks building what we call the iceberg. And so we all know, you know, for anyone who watches like National Geographic, that the iceberg that you see above the water is about 1/100th of the mass of the iceberg. The majority of the iceberg is below the waterline. That's what brought the Titanic down. And so you spend all this time in the writer's room building the parts of the iceberg that the audience will never even see, but you have to kind of build it, or the audience at some point will go, the characters are behaving completely and totally inconsistently. Why would she do that? That's my wife's favorite note. Why is he doing that? You know, and that's usually a byproduct of a flimsy iceberg. And so we spend that 10 weeks talking about the characters, building the characters out, talking about what the end point of the season is going to be. And then, you know, you end up getting mostly there. And then, you know, to Jackie's point earlier, there's an organic process to it too. So it's sort of like, everybody get in the car, we're heading for Denver, unless we all on the way there figure out that there's a more exciting place to go than Denver, then but we're never going to turn the car around and drive back the other direction. Like, and so knowing the destination, really knowing your characters, and then most importantly, kind of like knowing what it's about. I know that theme sounds very ethereal, but that's the most important thing that as a showrunner you can communicate to your staff, which is like, here's what I'm really chasing here. Like, this is what this is about for me. This may not be what it's about for you, but let's start to overlap our various Venn diagrams and identify the bullseye. To Sarah's point about like, what are we shooting for here? What's on the other side of the equal sign? If we can all agree what's on the other side of the equal sign, then we can build the equation to get there. But if we don't agree on what it is we're solving for, we're kind of doomed from the jump. And I've been on both sides, I've done it wrong enough times to know that that's the only way to do it.
It's hard. It's like to get a whole group of people to like have to sort of try to kind of collectively become one consciousness, and all be like when I think about characters, I think about them as like sort of tent posts, there's what the character's greatest desire is and what the character's greatest fear is. And the game gets played between, it's like two goalposts in a football field or something, and the whole game gets played between those two posts, and if you've done a really good job, you figured out a way that the characters, they're an obstacle, that their fear is the obstacle to their greatest desire. They're sort of getting in their own way the whole time. I mean, that's an incredibly compelling character for television. I'll go for seasons with that. But to get like a whole group of people, especially in the beginning, to kind of like agree and understand a character in the same way is really tricky. And I think that that's often why the first seasons of television shows are really hard. Like there's usually a huge gap between like how difficult the first season is and how difficult subsequent seasons are, because once you have subsequent seasons, you have that roadmap, you have the characters, they have history, like you have a collective, you have a map, you have something that you can show people and they can understand. But that first year, when you're just trying to get like a group of brains to all agree on something that's at that point still ephemeral and has never been seen before, it's tricky, and it's a bit of like, you're just kind of throwing spaghetti and hoping that it sticks.
The collaborative process of writing for television is probably one of the most interesting things about this job, because as a baby writer, you're kind of used to, okay, I'm just writing my scripts in isolation. And then Sarah, when you're talking about, all of a sudden you have these, in your case, 5 or 6 writers in one room who all have to kind of pull the story together. I can imagine the stress becomes very difficult for a first-time writer as well. So do you have ideas or advice for how a first-time staff writer can approach the job? One, that sets them up for success, and 2, makes your job as a showrunner easier.
I'll just jump in first and reiterate what I said earlier, which is you don't necessarily need to go to the showrunner. There are other writers in that room who have more experience than you do. And they are, that's where I would turn to first, in terms of, even if it's if your personality type requires feedback, that is to say, you want to know how you're doing, don't ask the showrunner if you're a staff writer how you're doing. It's not that it's inappropriate, but you're putting them in a tough spot. But if you ask, the person who was the rookie last year, or someone who's been in a couple of rooms, how am I doing? They're much more equipped to give you productive feedback. But like, don't, I think like, understand that there's an expectation on you to pitch in that room. And there's also an expectation on you to not pitch too much. How much is too much? This is what I call the Goldilocks Paradox, which is there is no such thing as just right. So the porridge is too hot, the porridge is too cold. Move, once it gets too hot, then you have to swing the other way. When you're passing through the pendulum, just right is in the middle. You never stay there. You're always moving through just right, but the more comfortable you are moving between hot and cold porridge, the more time around you and how people are reacting to you, you'll know that you're pitching too much, because you'll start getting the look. And if you're not pitching enough, it's because you're asking the question of yourself, am I pitching enough? That probably means you're not pitching enough. And so you'll get a vibe and a feel for it. Rely on the other writers to find flow. Trust your instincts. And like, I will say the single most important thing that I can say is, so many staff writers only want to pitch if they think that their pitch will be successful. And therefore they sit there in silence for hours and then pitch. And then if it isn't successful, then instead of learning the lesson of I need to pitch more, they sit there for double the amount of hours before they pitch again. If you get one idea through in a day, that's massively successful. So do you have to pitch 7 things to get the one idea through? Maybe, you know, but like, that's what you got to do. So don't hold yourself to this bar of like, it's got to be amazing in order for me to pitch it. Also, don't pitch everything. It is, again, finding flow and balance and confidence. The showrunner, if they are experienced, doesn't expect a staff writer to have mastery when they come into the room. So you actually should have a fair amount of latitude to screw up often. If you're trying and you are, and every once in a while you're landing the pitch, you're going to excel. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I remember my my first job, and I wasn't the most secure pitcher. Like I said, I was someone coming off of a corporate job in a room with 5 stand-up comedians, so it was very difficult for me to pitch jokes. So I positioned myself in direct sightline of the showrunner at all times, so that when I could get a line in, I knew he was looking at me. So it was just something strategic, and I've kept that seat probably in every room ever since then, unless I was running it. So I could wedge my way in with a bunch of very noisy people.
Now you just sit across from a mirror, right?
Exactly.
Now you just sit across from a mirror.
And frown at myself for my bad pitches. Exactly. And then I think what Damon was saying about sort of making friends, and what Sarah was saying about trust in the room, people do want you, if you're in a good trusting room, they want you to succeed. So even if you say something that only halfway makes sense, someone else will say, that sort of halfway made sense, and add to it. You have to realize that you're not in there alone. I'm really good at pitching straight lines, and there are a lot of funny people who can make that really funny, because you need a good straight line if you're going to have a good joke. So, that's something. And also, I sat next to someone who now has an Academy Award in my first job, but he was a stand-up, and I would pitch to him, just quietly, like, what do you think? And he'd say, yeah, go for it, just to, encourage me. So, build your allies. In other rooms, maybe it's not even the showrunner who's making the decision. The showrunner on my first show would always look at another writer to see if, sort of like qualify if that was really funny or appropriate or whatever. So by the end of the first season, I knew if I could make him laugh, not the showrunner, but a guy who was like 3rd down the ladder, then it was going in the script, because he was the biggest, loudest laugher. So yeah, you learn how to read the room, you learn how to pick your shots, and you learn how to get comfortable doing it, even if it does get shot down, even if nobody laughs, even if they think it's stupid. That should encourage you to come back again to redeem yourself.
Yeah, and I think that, to be completely honest, like there are good and bad rooms out here, or these people I probably run I know Damon does, like Jacque, and I don't know your rooms, but I'm confident that you run great rooms. So if you're in a great room, then go for it. Be brave, pitch hard. Like, I remember the first season of my first show, somebody was like pitching, and they were like, I think something happens on a train. The character was on the train, and somebody's pitch was like, I think something happens on the train. And I was like, great, what? And it was like, I don't know, I'm not there yet. I think something happens. I was like, that's not a fucking bitch. And I was so angry. I was like, yeah, I need 3 beats, like at least 3 beats. We're like, don't waste the time. But so my feeling is like, as everybody else has said, like, be brave, pitch stories, like it doesn't have to be perfect. Like, sort of bring, if you've got a story that, if you had something, at least in my work, like if something if something that we're talking about relates to something that you've been through, something that reminds you something of your own life, that's great. I'd love to hear that, because that's authentic and usually more interesting than anything I'm going to be able to come up with, off the top of my head. Like, what I'm always looking for is something authentic. And like authenticity, usually comes from real life. It usually doesn't come from, we we can all pitch stories we've heard before, but I don't want a story that I've heard before. I want a story I've never heard before. And usually that comes from something that you've lived through. That's, that's weird and painful and great or whatever. So if you're in a safe room, it's also, I think as showrunners, like as Jackie was saying, like it's our job to help you succeed. Like we're supposed to create a safe room, and we're supposed to help young writers like gain confidence and, feel secure. Like no young writer comes in thinking they know. I mean, sometimes they do, they don't usually last that long, but for the most part, like, good, mature, smart people come in with a healthy amount of trepidation. So it's part of our jobs to kind of like, all that saying, like, if you're in a good room, be brave, and believe that you deserve to be there, because you probably do at that point. Like, it's not usually a favor. And you will grow by learning. There are bad rooms though. There are dangerous rooms out there. Like there are rooms, where the person in charge, whether it's the showrunner or somebody not the showrunner, is, on some sort of ego trip, or, we're looking to pass blame around, or misogynist, or whatever it is. I've been in those rooms. And that's a room with then, I think you're in a slightly different situation there. It's not, sometimes you're in a bad room, and it's, there's a lot of back politics. There are people who are trying to get other people out so they can, that this is sometimes a phenomena that happens where like people are trying to, be the closest to the showrunner. And so they'll kind of like sabotage somebody else's pitches, or, in order to like make themselves ingratiate themselves to the showrunner. That's usually a problem with the showrunner, actually, like that, that person has set a bad tone for a room. And so like that competition is part of the room experience, and so you'll know that immediately if you get into a room like that. And if you do, my advice is like, do your best work and survive it. Try not to get fired, because that's not great for your career. And look for another opportunity someplace else.
Jackie and Damon, I'm curious to know if you also have advice on how to manage being in a negative room where it's not as supportive, or maybe, a writer is even being bullied or feels like they're not being listened to.
Let's say I don't think I've been in any bad rooms. I've certainly been in poorly run rooms. And in those situations where, I wasn't the showrunner, I've tried to make it clear to other writers kind of that I personally was a safe space. So, I would invite to try to find that person who you can, rely on as some sort of an ally. And otherwise, I think what Sarah said is true. You do your best and maybe keep your head down and try to avoid those sort of unnecessary conflictual situations.
I have never run a bad room, but I think that that's all in the eye of the beholder. And I suspect that a number of the writers who I've fired would probably say it was a bad room, or that I wasn't fair, or that their ideas were great and I didn't listen to them, or that I marginalized their pitches. Or so I'm just saying, take this for what it's worth. I think that I'm at my best when I have more time. And so on Lost, for example, we made 25 hours of that show in the first season. We started writing after the pilot. We started writing in the first week of June. And we wrote 24 episodes of Lost by the first week of April of the following year, which basically meant that every 8 days we were looking at a blank whiteboard, and 8 days later there would be an outline, and you had to repeat that process over and over and over again. And so that was probably a bad room, because the pressures were incredibly intensive. And I think that I was 31 years old, and my attitude was like the reality show, how every reality show, the contestants are like, I'm not here to make friends, but like, that was my attitude, which is, I don't care about your feelings as writers. We have to generate, and I'm not going to be cruel. I'm not going to bully you, but I cannot be, kind and generous. And like, my job is to basically thumbs up, thumbs down things pretty quickly. and the room seems to be telling me, if you don't like something, just tell us, because we get most frustrated when you indulge ideas that we know you don't like. But I had never done it before. And that was the first 9 episodes of the show. And then Carlton JJ was gone, who I created the show with, who had showrunning experience. And then I hired Carlton, who was my mentor, to partner with me on the show. And then I kind of learned on the job. And after a couple of years, I started understanding that, generating trust and camaraderie and humanity, all these things that we've been talking about in the early part of the call, were an essential part of the job. But I don't think I started there. And so I would love to be able to say that every writer that I've ever worked with, it's sad, because I wish I create. Is it a safe space, a writer's room? It is not, because as writers, you come in and you're bearing your soul. Our ideas, especially the ones that we think are great, are the most personal parts of ourselves. And if the showrunner says, nah, I don't get it, or I don't like it, it's devastating. So, but that's the job, So there's another level of safety that I think that we're talking about, where it comes to, I don't view myself as a bully. I don't view myself as a misogynist. I don't view myself as a racist, but I don't get to define those things. If any writer that has ever worked for me says he's racist, or he's a misogynist, or he's a bully, that was their experience. And I'm not going to take that from them, because I don't see myself that way. And so all I can say is I try to be as self-aware as possible. And most importantly, there is now a legit process through human resources and otherwise, where writers can be empowered to report me. I say to them right out of the jump, this is the number, this is the person that you call. If I make you feel uncomfortable, call that number, and there's not going to be any retaliation. I'm going to try my best not to do that, but and there has to be a reporting structure that doesn't report to me if I'm the person who is engaging in the behaviors. But it's an imperfect system, and I hope that I haven't violated any of the internal codes of the system. I believe that I haven't, but again, I don't get to say that. That's not my story to tell.
I think that's so important. What you're saying about remembering that somebody's experience can be very different depending on which perspective you bring in. A staff writer's perspective on a situation is going to be very different from a more senior level writer in that same situation. I'm just cognizant of the time. I do want to talk a little bit about writing, and I'm just curious if you guys have like a few more minutes after past 7 where I can keep you in so we can cover this topic with enough depth. Is that going to be okay? Okay, cool. So how do you decide who will write a given episode for your show?
We tend to, the way to handle it is that, so let's say there's 10 episodes, kind of put them up on the board, and usually try to break the season in some sort of shape before we start an individual episodes. It's not always possible to go through the whole season. And in the beginning, actually, I usually in a first season, like I really, by the time I'm getting into that room, like know what each episode is going to at least be about. And then I try to, and so then I actually try to sort of figure out who gravitates towards which episode. Like who feel, sometimes I'll even ask if I know the room well enough, just be like, how does everybody feel, like who wants what? Usually I know which episodes I particularly feel strongly about writing, and usually there's certain episodes I want to take the first pass at. And then after that, I'm just kind of like, okay, who feels personally unique about this episode. And then what happens is, so I'll kind of like, sometimes only do the first half of the season, just be like, okay, here's the first 5, and so everybody knows what they're doing. And a thing that I think different showrunners do differently, but we tend to have incredibly intensive outlines. like 25-page outlines, 30-page outlines, whatever. It's because everything, it's all cumulative. Like if I don't understand what's going on in episode 2, and then I get a script in that I've been working on, the assumption that we sort of decided on something in episode 2, but the writer has a different understanding of what we talked about. And so then we're on episode 4 and they're writing episode 2 completely differently. And I'm depending on episode 2 to come in a certain way because I've already, it's a disaster. So like we have to be on the same page. So even once the, be ad nauseum until I, and then I feel like all of us feel comfortable that we really understand that episode. And then that individual writer will go off and write the outline for that episode while we'll move on to the next episode. But it's usually like a pretty labor intensive sort of group oriented experience. So everybody knows every beat of every episode. I don't think I've had to have a lot of showrunner friends, and I know some showrunner. I mean, even the network was like, please turn in shorter outlines. Like we're tired. We don't have, we don't need to read these outlines. Like give us a 5-page outline. It's fine. I was like, no, it's not. I can't handle a 5-page outline. I don't know what's actually going on.
Yeah, my process has been pretty similar, even though they are largely standalone episodes. We will, so as a group, and once we get it approved by the studio and network, we will go ahead and beat out the episode. Not to the extent that it's the outline 25-page outline, because that would be the length of
hours, right? Yeah, it's
love it. I wish I could. And then it's usually, the person who writes the outline is going to write the episode. And like Sarah was saying, if I think that there's something in the story that they'll have a particular handle on, or they have a personal experience that I know relates to that, or they have a comedic sensibility that will, support what's funny in that episode, then I'll assign it to them. And sometimes it's luck of the draw. But, as you get towards the end of the season and everyone's tired, it's like, you do it, just hand it off to somebody. But yeah, I usually try to match some element of the episode with the writer. So I think that, they can really bring it home for us.
I'm always solving for some degree for group authorship. And that is to say that I want we're all channeling the show. The show is telling us what it wants to be. And so there's a consistency of voice from episode to episode, but at the same time, as we were talking about why we hire certain writers, et cetera, I think like the ultimate authorship is that each episode has its own specific character. Even when you're doing serialized storytelling, try to do this in Lost and The Leftovers and Watchmen, is each episode is about, this is the Looking Glass one, this is the Sawyer one, this is the Hurley one, this is the Erica Murphy one. So and what ends up happening is different writers have different affinities for different characters. But what I'm hoping for is, the vibe that we're going for is that when you're in a circle in the wet and kind of doing their dance move, you're who's going to go in next? And so what I'm looking for is someone to take a leadership position. And very often, I'm sure this is the case in Jackie and Sarah's rooms as well, someone will have the idea that lights the room on fire. You're kind of struggling, and then someone, very rarely me, says what if this happened? And then it's that Jenga tile that allows you to construct the entire tower. And that person is usually the one who gets that episode. And the whole room wants it to be them, because it's sort of you were the one who got in the middle of the circle and started dancing when we needed it most. And it's kind of apparent, if you just let the organic process happen. When you force it and you're basically you will write episode 2, you will write episode 3, you will write episode 4, before you've even figured out what those episodes are, it's putting a lot of pressure on that writer's shoulders, but also the room starts to go I don't really need to invest that much energy because that's their episode. So the longer you hold back on the assignment, the more we collectively are invested. And I think that when it comes to Watchmen, certainly we can all identify ideas that we had in each other's episodes, but we're all rooting for like it at the end of the day, like who gives a shit who wrote that episode? I mean, that person is doing like the heavy lifting and the generation of these materials, but outside of like awards consideration, like, you know, what you're solving for is we're all going to get our turn. We're all going to end up writing an outline and writing an episode, but you want everybody to be invested in everybody else's work.
Yeah, I'm always surprised when I see on social media someone touting their episode of a, you know, is airing tonight, because you know, we all know everybody contributed so much to that. I mean, even if you generated the initial idea or it's some, you know, I might have perfectly in half hour, probably 70% of the words never came out of your computer. So, yeah, it's sort of an odd concept to me.
I remember a few years ago, I was after I had gone into the entertainment industry and I understood how the TV writing process worked. I was reading an AV Club review of some TV show, and they talked about the writer behind the episode in a way where it sounded like that person was the sole creative ideator behind it. And I was like, that's not how that works at all. And it's just really cool to hear all of you approach it from the perspective of, yeah, it's a really collaborative process. These episodes will have everybody's fingerprint in it somewhere. So okay, you've got a writer and they've written a draft of their episode. Does it immediately go to the studio for notes, or do you like to take a look at it first?
Well, the way we do it is it immediately goes back to the room for an immediate rewrite. And, you know, we start at page 1, and in the best of circumstances, the structure is great, and all we're doing is clarifying it, and because it's comedy, adding funny stuff. In the worst of circumstances, we're kind of starting over, and with the same premise, going from page 1 and totally renovating the foundation and the structure and everything else. But that's rare. Most of the time, as you go, the next step is to bring it back to the room and make it as pretty as possible before we send it onto the studio network.
Yeah, we don't tend to bring scripts back to the room unless there's a problem with the script, unless there's like something that's not working for some reason. Like usually if I'll get a draft, give out the writer a second draft. Maybe sometimes or there's, you know, that over the years I've had a handful of writers whose work I just don't touch because they're so good. That's pretty rare. So usually I'll take it over myself before it goes to the network, because, you know, you want, my feeling is like you want the script to be as good as possible by the time it goes to the network. You don't want to turn in anything that's not done. Unless you're like trying to prove some sort of point in a super passive aggressive way or something. So yeah, usually I'll take a pass, and then they'll go to the network, and then there'll be notes from the network. And then again, it sort of depends on whether or not I think that the writer can handle the notes. If I think the writer can, I'll give the episode back to the writer to let them take a pass. If I'm sort of at a place where like I think that the writer's done everything they can do on the script, or sort of, you know, reach their you know, sort of hit their ceiling in terms of what they're capable of, I'll just do the notes myself. Because part of what you're trying to do is keep the train moving, you know. So again, it sort of depends on the showrunner, but I've definitely hired writers on staff that I know are not great television writers, and which is interesting. Like they're like brilliant playwrights, or journalists, or, you know, or whatever, or like but I know they're not great at TV, but I appreciate their perspective, their life, their lived experience. You know, like I have had a writer on my show for years who never learned to write television, but he was such a brilliant man that I just, you know, was like, well, let's just keep him around, because he was older too, you know, so he had like a perspective that none of us, he was in his 60s, so none of us had that perspective. And like, you know, so we just, and he always would generate such good ideas in the room, and he would make you see things from another angle, and he was very challenging. And like, So he stayed, and I knew every time that he would go to script that like I was going to end up writing that script from page one, but it was okay because he, you know, he had been valuable in other ways. And I lots of showrunners feel like showrunners will usually tell you that somebody is great in a room, but not so great on the page, or great on the page, not so great in the room. If you're both, you usually become a showrunner yourself. Like that's the, you know, that's a bit of the holy grail. You know, if you can do both, you're sort of on your way to doing it, you know, being your own boss that way. But yeah, I'm sorry. The original question was like, do you take a pass before it goes to the network? And yeah, that's your job. That's a showrunner.
In the realm of doing less episodes, I've come to around to just co-writing almost all episodes. So I think with the exception of the pilot of Watchmen, even inclusive of all the episodes of The Leftovers over 3 seasons, that the pilot of Watchmen is the only episode that and when I do that, when I form these kind of like ad hoc partnerships, we start trading pages very early in the process. So like when we break the story as a collective room, then when we go to outline, and I write outlines very similar to Sarah's, where the studio and network are begging me to be less specific, but that's really the document like by which if you can nail the outline is really secure. And so if there are any issues, I'd rather identify them both internally and externally at outline, because when you go to the time and effort to write a script and then there's a fundamental piece missing or the story needs to be blown up, you've invested a lot of time unnecessarily to go back. So, you know, with almost all the Watchmen and Leftovers episodes, I was like, you know, Cord, I'm writing this one with you. Crystal, I'm writing this one with you. Leela, I'm writing this one with you. And we just start, I'm like, you have a beat on this scene. Why don't you write the outline version of it and I'll do the next 2 scenes. Then I email her those scenes. And so by the time there's an actual outline, we've both noticed each other a bunch of times. And so the document that we're sending off to the network feels like we've both touched it. And by doing it that way, I don't have to do the final pass anymore. I've actually been kind of noticing it in progress. And it takes more time, you know, but when you're making less episodes, I still feel like you have so much time when you're doing, you know, 9 or 10 episodes, because I cut my teeth, you know, doing 25 a season. So I still feel like it's incredibly indulgent process.
Awesome. You've already answered my next question, which is kind of what your approach is to rewriting. So I think I kind of want to close out by asking, this question comes in from Pearl. What are some specific ways you help build and curate culture within your rooms? And how can writers contribute to helping you cultivate that environment?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that, I do think that is absolutely the showrunner's job from the get-go. Like in the culture of the room, I do think is really important. And also like allowing the conversation to sort of go in other ways and sort of bring it back. I mean, never done it before, and I wasn't sure I could do it. So I'd freak, you know, if I felt like we weren't getting somewhere. I mean, this is just me, but I feel like we weren't getting somewhere, we weren't breaking the episode. We were stuck, like take my ball and like go off into a corner and like break the whole episode myself and come back. Wasn't great. So part of my job and, you know, part of what I got better at over the years was being able to be like, okay, this is what I'm trying to do, you know, and then kind of getting people to weigh in. And even if they were weighing in things that like I knew ultimately probably weren't going to be where I wanted to go, like just providing enough space to let people bring their A game, and start to feel safe. And then somehow we could kind of, it's a little alchematic. I don't quite know how to describe it. It's like nothing's working. You're not getting where the people are trying, and then like something kind of catches, and then all of a sudden you're kind of like off to the races on a story that people are on board with. Collaborative creative space. It's about, in order to kind of find momentum. Like in the beginning, you need to just kind of allow for that sort of amorphous, the safe space in order for people to start to like bring their stuff, and then you can kind of start to curate. Now, one thing that I will say is that you do have to be aware, I think, as a showrunner, and it does get harder as you get older and you've got and you're more secure, of people feeling silenced in the room. And it can happen, when I was young and I was in that position of feeling silenced a lot, I was acutely aware of it. And then actually something happened like in a room like not so long ago, right? This young writer who's brilliant, who kind of came to me at some point and said that she was feeling that this older male writer, she was a younger Black woman, he was an older white male, was kind of stepping over her, and sort of interrupting her all the time. And to be totally honest, I hadn't seen it, because my perspective was she was so goddamn brilliant, and seemed so confident, and he was not our strongest writer and seemed really insecure to me a lot of the time. And so I was like, what are you talking about? Like you're sort of wiping the floor with this person. But from her perspective, he's 20 years older, maybe more. And he was interrupting her, and she did feel like slighted by that. And I was lucky that she came to me and spoke up, because people don't always do that. But it definitely was for me like one of those moments where it's like, yeah, I got to be a little bit more careful here. And then I've definitely had cultures, like I've had rooms, where like people have just gotten kind of like at each other's throats. Like I had one room where like these two writers were just like at each other's throats. They hated each other. And I thought somehow, I don't know, I had like read some management book. I don't know what the fuck I was thinking, but I was like, okay, I'm gonna like be a good manager right now. And I'm gonna like pull them into my office and be like, watch the TED Talk or something where that worked. So I did that like in front of other people, and they were both so mad at me for it. They were like, oh, it just, nothing got better. It just got worse. And it was like, and at the end of the day, it was quite performative on my part. Like I was trying to be a manager, be a boss, or that. I think that like, sometimes it's just a little bit of trial and error. You try your best to kind of like manage the situation. You don't always do it right. You learn from it, you pivot, you try to do it again. But I think like trying to make sure that everybody feels respected and heard, and like you're approaching them with integrity and expecting them to approach each other with integrity, like it goes a long way. It does get you somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that there's a fine line between culture and cult. And I think that very often the culture of the room is a byproduct of the cult leader, and I want to be as aware of that as I humanly can, but it's very important to me that the writer's room, particularly the writer's room, and the show writ large beyond the writer's room, but we're speaking very specifically about the writer's room, that it has an identity absent me. That is to say, when I'm out of the room, I want there to be real camaraderie amongst everybody else in it. And sometimes that means that they're all complaining about me. And that space, that's a very, I think, healthy culture to have, as long as they trust me. But it's sort of like, I know that I can be moody. I know that I can be hard on ideas. I know that, I I can be infuriating, but then once I'm in the room, I want everyone to feel like we're all on the same team again. And so there's almost, this is not by design, it's just by circumstance. There's almost two different cultures, which is the room as I imagine it when I'm not in it, and wanting to give that a lot of space to breathe. When Damon's in here, which is more often than not, I'd say 90% of the time I'm in that room, and the other 10% of the time. But I want the writers to hang out with one another, and they have text threads that I'm not on, and text threads on. And I think that's all, and I've gotten much more comfortable with that someone was talking about me behind my back versus, them talking about me behind my back is actually really integral to team building. And so you can't control culture. It's the culture of the Watchmen writers room was much different than the culture of the Leftovers writers room, because there were different people in those rooms and the shows were different things. And trying not to be a cult leader is the best sort of advice I can give. If that's indeed what's even being solicited here, but it's a.
Yeah, I think I don't like hierarchical rooms at all. And so pretty much from the first day after I lay out, my opening statement, whatever that is, then I make sure that everyone is, part of the conversation, that no one is really dominating. When I was at HBS, I hated cold calls, but as a writer, as running a room, if someone is being super quiet for a long time, I'll just ask them, what do you think? Not particularly putting them on the spot about a story or a joke, but maybe they're just a slow thinker or a slow talker or somewhat intimidated. So I do want to, let everyone know that I'm listening and that everyone should be listening and paying attention, and everyone's thoughts are as valuable. I think everybody is funny and valuable, or they wouldn't be there. It is really important, a really key part of what you're doing. You're really trying to get the best performance out of each one of your so-called players. And somebody might need a little bit more attention than somebody else. Other people have been there for a long time, and they're pros, and they know how to pitch and how to how to work a story and how to really talk about characters. And some people aren't as articulate, or might take 14 paragraphs to get to 3 thoughts. And you have to be sort of respectful of everybody's process. And I think that really is kind of the key word, just being respectful of all of the other writers. And once you set that tone, that if someone's being insulting or people are fighting, that's just not going to go down. You can decide how you're going to handle it. But I think people know that from pretty early on that we're all going to be respectful. We're all going to listen to each other's thoughts. I said, work hard, be nice. And pretty much if you can do those two things, you're 80% of the way there. Just remind yourself, keep working hard, keep being nice. We'll all go home and have dinner with our family sometime.
It's reassuring to hear you as a showrunner say, yeah, let's make sure everybody gets home to have dinner with their families, because I know some showrunners may not prioritize that. So it's good to hear, Jacque. Kind of last as a closing question, I ask this in every panel. Did you, but specifically for you three, did you consume any piece of pop culture over this past winter break that you are an evangelist for? For me, it was Bridgerton. I couldn't get enough of it. I binged it in 2.5 days. It was wonderful.
Man, I wish I had. I've been working and putting all of those, Bridgerton and whatever that, all of the shows that I want to see are destined for February.
Yeah, for me, sorry, I was just going to say How To with John Wilson, which is it's on HBO.
Mm-hmm.
It's poetry. I'm a huge fan of Nathan For You, and Nathan Fielder executive produces it, but this guy's a documentarian and he lives in New York, and he just shoots a tremendous amount of footage, but then he organizes it around a certain theme, and it's sort of hilarious but like deeply and profoundly poignant. And I'm not spoiling anything, but the final, I think it's 6 half-hour episodes, but the 6th one is when COVID is first happening in New York. So you see 5 episodes of what is being collectively referred to as the before times. And then, so it just felt like it was the beginning. We're collectively and culturally and artistically beginning to process the pandemic. And it was the first thing that I saw that basically started talking about that feeling, which is a bit of an intangible, right? I don't even know how to verbalize yet, other than it fucking sucks. But like I don't know how to artistically verbalize this feeling that we're all collectively experiencing, but how to with John Wilson somehow does, like it, not just in the COVID episode, but there is an existential loneliness and isolation that he is experiencing as an artist that felt very apropos for what I was going through and am going through. And so it's just, I'm a total evangelist for it. It's awesome.
I, for some reason, got into documentaries on the making of failed Broadway musicals. So it's like, it's amazing. And that, so that I was like torturing my poor fiance to make him watch these things with me to relax. And then that led us to trying to find All That Jazz, which I hadn't seen, but it's hard to find actually, because it doesn't stream anywhere. So he had to like get it off the dark web or something. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't be saying that, but so then we saw All That Jazz, which was amazing. That was amazing. Like if you haven't seen it, get it off the dark web, because it's so good. It's so like crazily psychedelically brilliant. Mind-blowingly good. Like wrote fan mail to all the creators. So that was fun. That was like a whole COVID arc.
So good. Jacque, Sarah, and Damon, thank you so much for coming in and speaking with us today, and for staying almost half an hour past the end of our session. That was so generous of you to provide your time for us today.
What else are we doing? I can't use the excuse that I need to go home and have dinner with my family because they're right downstairs.
I actually think that we're very lucky, because this is time that I think the 3 of you would normally be commuting and coming home, or spending time with your family. So I'm very, very privileged to be able to have this conversation with you at this specific time. And yes, thank you so much for providing your insights, your wisdom, your warmth, and your kindness to us. It's meant a great deal. And with that, everybody, that brings us to the conclusion of our final speaker series for this Harvardwood module. Thanks so much for tuning in for these past 4. It's been a delight to be your moderator. And yeah, looking forward to the end of these modules, and keep writing.